Sivuili, you'll tell me when you want me to share my screen, will you? Yeah. After you've done an introduction.
Yes, I'll do.
Okay.
So much.
Yep. No.
Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar today. 2022 marks 50 years of the observatory in the Karoo. So we have lined up a number of activities to celebrate this milestone. And part of our program is this history webinars. So I'm very happy and excited today that we have Dr. Robin Catchpole as our first presenter in this history series. So he will reflect on his time at the observatory in Sutherland and generally in the research that he conducted while he was still here. Dr. Robin Catchpole obtained his BSc degree at the University of London. Then he was posted at the then Royal Observatory here in Cape Town, and he completed his PhD at the University of Cape Town. I'm glad that Professor Brian Warner is also part of the audience because he worked with him at the time. I think he was his supervisor. So his interest is in the composition of stars, the structure of our galaxies with a black hole at the center. So he spent more than a quarter of a century working here in South Africa, initially in Pretoria, and then here in Cape Town and Sutherland. So I'll hand over to him. Thank you so much, Robin, for agreeing to do this talk today. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay.
So you can share your slides.
Screen. Yes. As can you see? Whoopsie. Can you see my presentation there?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. Okay. Right. Well, I'm just sorry I can't be there in the flesh to talk to you today, seeing so many friends. And as you've heard, my supervisor is listening, so I'd better do my best. But before I start, I want to just emphasize that this talk today is very much based on my own personal reminiscences, memories, and experiences. So, you know, I hope nobody feels left out or ignored or whatever. But before I start with those, I just want to start off with some background. Now, in the mid-1960s, it was clear that observational conditions were seriously deteriorating in Cape Town, Pretoria, and Johannesburg. And when David Evans returned to the Cape after a sabbatical, in 1966, he suggested to Stoy, the director of the Royal Observatory at the Cape, that they should search for a better site for their relatively new 40-inch Elizabeth telescope, and even suggested that they might consider a similar site for the 74-inch. Now, the Republic Observatory, it was the old Union Observatory, as it's still known if you look on bookshelves here in at the observatory in Cambridge, had been under the control of the CSIR since 1964, and in 1967 was given permission to look for a new site with a proviso that it must be at least 75 miles from Johannesburg and no more than 75 miles from one of the other university sites in South Africa. The idea was they didn't want to move it and then have to move it again as the urban areas of Johannesburg grew. So by 1968, Evans and his team had focused on 3 sites in the Sutherland area, and Sutherland was chosen because it is at that boundary between the summer and winter rainfall areas, and the sites they were looking at were a sufficient distance from the edge of the escarpment that they would not suffer from the sort of orographic cloud. And here we see, this is from David Evans's Under Capricorn, a picture of the site. And I think you can see in the background, this is the ridge on which the observatory has been built. Initially, they were looking at areas that were close to the road to minimize the amount of money that would be spent. And here we see Joe Cherms and David Evans using this instrument that was used to measure the seeing. And you can quite clearly see the ridge on which the observatory now stands in the background here. At the time, they were not so keen on operating on top of a ridge like this because they were worried about the orographic cloud, or a ridge cloud as we tend to see it. Now, to see what the situation was in South Africa at this time, we must go back to 1960. When, after discussions with Richard Stoy, who was the astronomer at the Cape, Her Majesty's astronomer, Woolley, who was the Astronomer Royal and director of the Royal Greenwich Observatory, took ultimate control of the Cape Observatory. They were both still funded by the British Admiralty until about 1965, when the Science Research Council took over from the Admiralty. And because of these political circumstances, as it were, in Under Capricorn, Evans says that the possibility of a new observatory coming to pass seemed very doubtful. And indeed, the Cape staff became concerned about the future of the Cape Observatory, since official quarters had begun to show interest in establishing the Anglo-Australian Observatory, and even for a time, and I remember Woolley was very keen on this, likely to join in the foundation of an observatory in Saudi Arabia. Furthermore, it was thought that when Woolley retired as Astronomer Royal at the end of 1971, he was expecting to come to the Cape to wind up the observatory. Now, so this was the situation, and Evans notes in his personal notes, apparently, that he was offered a post at the University of Texas, where he had previously been for his sabbatical, and he offered to stay in South Africa if he could be given a promise that the Sutherland Observatory would be developed. But the promise couldn't be given. And in 1968, both David Evans and Richard Stoy resigned. Now, however, everything changed again in 1970. South Africa, through the CSIR, was very keen to have a stake in South African astronomy. And this was part of Forster's kind of trying to forge more, liberalize a little bit and forge more overseas links. And when Woolley visited in 1970, the decision was made to adopt Sutherland as the current site, as the best current site for the observatory, as opposed to the site that the Republic Observatory had been looking at on a farm near Richmond. This all caused a certain amount of bad feeling, as did in the situation in July of 1970. A confidential agreement was made for the CSIR to take over the Cape Observatory and develop the Sutherland site. At the same time, they would close the Union Observatory, and the 20-inch telescope would be transferred to Sutherland. And this was made public in 1970 or so and caused a certain amount of upset and stir, as you can imagine. So on the 1st of January 1972, which is the occasion we are celebrating today, the Royal Observatory became the South African Astronomical Observatory, and Woolley became Sir Richard Woolley became its first director, having just retired as Astronomer Royal and director just, the month before, as it were. Now, the building of Sutherland had commenced in March 71. Woolley started in January 72 and was complete by June 1972. And I was very impressed by how quickly that seems to have gone ahead. And by June 72, the observatory consisted of 3 domes, 9 houses, an office block, a workshop, 2 two-bedroom chalets for the astronomers, and 8 kilometers of road. So this, I think, was a very impressive rapid development. And by the end of 1972, the 40-inch Elizabeth telescope was in action, the 20-inch Boller and Chipper telescope was in action, and the MRM, the multi-reflector mount, only actually came in October 73, and the 30-inch in 1975. But the observatory was up and running. Now, my own first visit to Sutherland was in March 73 for the official opening. Louise Webster, who was a distinguished Australian astronomer, and I drove down to Cape Town from the Radcliffe Observatory in Pretoria on the 7th of March for a short symposium that took place before the opening. It was the good and the great were gathered there, some astronomers, and we talked about, and I remember talks on the BL-LAC objects. This is a little montage of various bits and pieces that were handed out to the VIPs to honor the opening day in 1973. Needless to say, Louise and I were not amongst the VIPs. And the night before the opening, the VIP astronomers all moved up to Mikesfontein to spend the night there. And Louise and I found a kind of Lossie's house outside Langsberg, where we spent our night before driving up to Sutherland on the morning of the opening. And you can see the day started with a beautiful blue sky. It had certainly not been like this a couple of days before. A massive cold front had gone through. The wind was roaring, the rain was pouring. They barely managed to rig the tent, and in the process, they managed to drive a stake through the power supply for the dome in the middle, which didn't help things. But on the day of the opening, all was well, and 2 super Freelon helicopters arrived with the Prime Minister's party. And you can see they threw up a huge amount of dust, and in the process, you'll see all these flying fragments here. This was the paint being blown off the shutters around the 20-inch telescope, all flying through the air. And you can see this guy. And then here we came, the B.J. Forster and a number of cabinet ministers stepped out and headed for the refreshment tent. And here we are inside the refreshment tent. Refreshments were served and lunch was served. And on the left here, we see Forster not talking to Minister Lutz. And on the right, we see Sir Richard Woolley listening to Teenie Forster, Forster's wife. Now, of course, the great attraction of the event was the presence of Margaret Thatcher, and that's why there were so many cabinet ministers turned up for the opening. She was Secretary of State for Education and Science, and this was a great moment for Forster to have a contact with the with a senior member of the British government, which was very much what was going on with this whole opening. There's Boerter behind. I must say, when Forster came close, and I was standing near him in the tent, I had that same feeling of chill that I felt 25 years later when I met Putin going around the observatory in Greenwich. That sort of, you don't want to feel, you don't want to be too close. So we all sat down, gathered together to sit down to listen to 5 speeches. The first speech by Brink, the head of the CSIR, then Minister Lutz, the Minister of Planning and Statistics, Forster, Margaret Thatcher, and Sir Richard Woolley all gave speeches, and I don't remember a single word that anyone said, apart from Woolley, who spoke Afrikaans and hinted that the present telescopes were tamelijk klein, which means fairly small, hinting of better things to come, or so he hoped. Now, at the end of all that, Forster unveiled the bronze plaque hidden behind the old South African flag, and this plaque was later mounted at the entrance gate of the observatory at a convenient height so that we could demonstrate our loyalty to the management and the government by peeing on it when we arrived for a week of observing. That would be an hour after we'd finished our beers at Sutherland. So we were, that was an opportune place and moment for such an event. Afterwards, we all trooped outside to watch Forster ceremonially open the 40-inch dome. He was supposed to press a button on a box, but his security staff absolutely would not allow that. Forster wasn't going to press any buttons on boxes. So the dome was opened, by pressing buttons inside the dome through a series of hand signals that were given at the appropriate time. And the similar thing was done with the 30-inch, which had to be hand opened because the power had gone anyway. The 30-inch had been reserved as the private lavatory for Margaret Thatcher. I don't know whether she used the facilities. So, we always paid suitable respect to that facility ever since. There we are. So there we are. After that, the excitement was over. There's Margaret Thatcher. And of course, this was a great chance for us to mix with the good and the great. And you'll see, I'm sure you'll all recognize Ian Glass here. There's Margaret Burbidge, who was the current director of the Royal Greenwich Observatory. And we are, or he is talking to, I think this is Jim Hosey, who was a very senior UK civil servant involved in all these kind of negotiations. And here we see the little Radcliffe contingent, Ian Glass in the background there, Louise Webster, Michael Feast, and Peter Andrews. So at this stage, Forster headed back to wherever he went in his helicopter. Louise and I headed off to Victoria West on our way back to Pretoria, and the VIPs all went back to Maatjiesfontein for a second night and a grand celebratory dinner. Woolley set the tone that meant for many years after, on our way up to Sutherland on Monday mornings at the start of the week, we would stop for lunch and a beer at the Laird's Arms. And here, if you are visiting, you will be able to see Pole here above the fireplace and Queen Victoria above the bar looking at each other. And I was always struck at the extraordinary similarity between their faces. And as I say, Woolley struck a certain style. He insisted that the astronomers at Sutherland sat down to dinner together and were served a 3-course meal followed by coffee. And although my favorite meal at Sutherland was always breakfast at lunchtime, which always included fried eggs and bacon. 18 months later, on the 1st of April 1974, the Radcliffe Observatory officially closed. And in September of this year, of 74, the takedown started. The CSIR had bought the telescope for 100,000 Rand, and it was to be transferred to Cape Town. And the crane arrived and the takedown commenced. We had Mick Dermody from the UK, who was a bit of a worrier about how things would be done. And we had Rusty Pretorius, who I think we see here on the right. And he knew nothing about telescopes. He just saw that you just unbolted chunks of them, craned them out, loaded them up and sent them off to Sutherland. And this was a very typical scene. We see two engineers, I think this is our old friend Dennis Pullin here, both giving instructions to the crane driver, each with a man in support, but needless to say, the crane driver would have had his eyes firmly fixed on Rusty Pretorius. When I saw it all being taken down, I couldn't believe that it would ever go together again. And here we see it, bits of it lying all over the ground, and people would be there unbolting other bits. And one really couldn't believe it would go together. And there we see another scene of this situation. Now, one of the most exciting or worrying moments was the time when it came to lift out the 18-ton polar axis. And it's mounted on its north and south and north piers here. The crane driver, of course, couldn't see what was going on in here. And so somebody had to signal to him, this guy sitting in the window, what he had to do. The crane was designed to lift the weight, but when the power was applied, nothing happened. The polar axis did not move. And as the power was increased, the crane lifted off the ground and rocked forward, and still nothing happened. So what they managed to do was, by letting the brakes on and off, they managed to kind of get the crane to rock and provide an impulse. And suddenly the polar axis broke free, the crane rocked back, the polar axis went up in the air and then bounced down, and the south end smacked the top of the pillar extremely hard. What had happened was there was nobody had noticed, some retaining screws had been left in an end plate here, and the thing only moved when the screws finally sheared through. Rusty had the reputation for demolishing a crane jib on a previous project he was working on. So that was, it was a close shave, I think, but it didn't happen again. So fortunately, all was well. The polar axis came out of the dome. And then as it neared the ground, there's Rusty, there's Mick, and suddenly everybody realized there was nowhere to put it. So what they had to do was rush off to Pretoria before the shops closed and buy a whole stack of balks of timber before they before they could lower the thing onto the ground and release the crane. Now, Rusty had a bit of a reputation for wildness, and it was alleged that when he drove up to Sutherland on the Mykesfontein Sutherland Road, he managed to sit on the roof of his Mercedes with his feet through the sunroof, his feet on the wheels and a brick on the accelerator, and drive the car a good way along that road. But he certainly had the ability to get things done. At the end of 1974, the telescope and dome had moved to Sutherland, and re-erection started during 1975. And I'd also left Pretoria in late 74, and this assembly was well underway by the time I arrived in April 75. And here we see various parts of the telescope lying on the ground. There's the roof, there's the polar axis, and there's the tube. And you will see the dome has been re-erected, but none of the shuttering has yet been erected. And here we see the top shutter here about to be lifted into place. And here is the polar axis. And So everything, as you can see, it was extraordinary again that it all went together. You can see everything seems to be just out in the felt. You can see where the grease had been. The grease was like fudge, a sort of sticky toffee, and all this had to be cleaned up, and it was all reassembled. When the telescope was finally put together and it was all reassembled inside the dome, I arrived one morning to find that Brian Hucklesby, I think it was, Brian Hucklesby, he had attached the telescope wouldn't move. So he had attached a turfer to the drive wheel here. A turfer is a device for straining a cable with a strain up to a sort of typically up to a ton or so. And to my horror, he was working the turfer, and finally he got the thing to rotate, and all was well thereafter. As you can see, health and safety wasn't a great consideration. There was no railings on the balcony here, bits of the telescope down the bottom, and I don't know what Mike Feast and Rusty Pretorius are discussing there, but something important. Once the telescope was aligned, our first task was to, assembled, our first task was to align it. And in the process of aligning it, the first thing we did was set up the Newtonian focus with a wind corrector that gives a flat field. And I was involved in this along with the others at night, and went up in the Newtonian carriage to access the focus. We had the telescope vertical, and it was much easier to climb onto the telescope frame when you wanted to work on it than sort of hang over the end of the Newtonian carriage. So just before I climbed onto the telescope, I saw some bare wires sticking out and thought that, well, it wasn't a good idea to have bare wires poking at me. So I just took one and turned it inwards and touched the frame of the telescope. There was a flash and a loud bang, and everything went completely black. It turned out this was an old system for powering an iron arc with a 600-volt supply that had never been used at Pretoria, but had been connected up again. Everything was plunged into darkness. Joe Cherms, who was standing on the floor, was horrified. He thought I'd electrocuted myself, but all was well. So we managed to get that going. We got the telescope aligned, and we took what is probably the only picture with the wind corrector of 30 Doradus, this beautiful image that was later used in the 1981 annual report on the cover there. And it, you know, these things you set up are things that suddenly you find nobody ever gets to use. And throughout the commissioning, it was very much a close cooperative work with the workshop staff and the astronomers, very much working together. And it might just as soon have been me wielding the spanner as one of them. And that was, you know, those were happy, busy days when we tended to work all day and half the night just to get the job done. By the middle of 1976, commissioning was finished. All the instruments were working, and we were using the Coude spectrograph, and you know that was really the final instrument that was commissioned, and the thing was well underway. A few weeks later, returning to Sutherland at the end of this commissioning period, I learned a lesson that has stayed with me ever since. The Sutherland Road had been cut, and as we approached the cut, you can see just over the top of the barrier there, the cut in the road. From relatively close, it looked like nothing more than a thin black line drawn across the road. But that was not what it was. As we got closer, we realized that it was a gap about 50 feet or more across. There had been a couple of nights before a flash flood that had just washed out the road embankment adjacent to the bridge, hadn't washed the bridge out. And early in the morning, the mayor and his wife of Sutherland had come down in the rain, obviously not seen this thin black line that turned out to be a gap in the road, and were killed. And it was certainly sobering to see how little you could see until you were almost on top of it. So every time I've driven along a road where one thinks, you know, not many people drive, where the conditions might be a bit variable, I've borne that in mind. I estimated if they'd traveled at 120 miles an hour, they might have cleared the gap, because the car struck the bank only a little way below the surface of the cut. Sadly, this was not the only death, and David Thackeray was killed on the return from Sutherland after an observing trip on the 21st of February 1978. Now, I just want to highlight some of the things that were done at the observatory in those early days. And certainly, I think as far as public highlights go, the ones that, and these are the ones that, as it were, made the newspapers in South Africa. There was Halley's Comet in 1986, and the observatory took part in a series of obtaining images of the comet, a lot of them done with the refractor mounts that were on the other side of the 30-inch telescope, and now stand by the road outside Sutherland. Then that was 1986, and then in 1987 came supernova 1987A. And this was not just a public event, but it was very much a scientific event. When we had news, when Brian Warner was, I think, the first to communicate news of this event to us in Cape Town, we immediately started observations. I remember going up to Sutherland that day to start infrared observations. And in a sense, the supernova polarized the observatories to a certain extent. Those that were very keen that as much observation as possible should be done, and those that felt it rather interfered with normal life. We made a decision to publish the observations as fast as possible, and 5 papers in pink pages were published covering the first 616 days within just over 2 years, which is, was pretty good for not only getting the observations reduced, but into print and in the press, as it were, so that theoreticians could, we could share those observations so they could feed into the kind of theoretical interpretation of what was going on. And we also made the decision that we would ask visiting astronomers to donate some time. And although only maybe 3 or 4 people were actively involved in all this work, in the reduction and publication and so on, there was an average of 23 authors on each of the 6 papers. This was just an attempt, and I think a very successful attempt, to get the data moving and into the community as fast as possible. And of course, things are done much faster these days, but for 1986, I think this was pretty good. And then, of course, there was in 1994, there was the impact of Schumacher-Levy 9, which I was not around then, but that certainly made a big impact on the public at large. Oh, this little picture here, that's me standing on the top of the polar axis of what was the MRM 30-inch telescope, infrared. And this was just to illustrate the fact that the supernova 1987A was circumpolar, so we had to go to some fairly extreme positions to make observations throughout the year. Now, if I think back to the, as it were, the founding research heritage of the observatory, two things spring to mind. And the one is Brian Warner and Ed Nather. Here we see Brian with an illustration of a cataclysmic variable, cataclysmic variables. Brian Warner and Ed Nather introduced high-speed photometry, which was a lot of which was done on the 20-inch telescope, a tradition that was very much, well, carried on or simultaneously by Don Kurtz and Louis Bologna. And I think that was one of the great founding heritages of the early observatory, this high-speed photometry. And the other was infrared photometry, thanks to the efforts of Ian Glass developing a whole series of infrared photometers and spectrometers and so on that were used principally on the 1.9, 74-inch and the 30-inch telescopes. And those, in my mind, and I'm sure there will be others who will spot other very important things that were done at the observatory in the early days, but I think these two fields set the tone of the observatory. And I briefly now, just to round up, want to just describe the one project that I was involved in that is something I'm still rather proud of to this day. And Patricia Whitelock, Ian Glass, and myself were doing regular infrared photometry of red variables on various telescopes. And we often noticed that there were other red sources as bright as the ones that we were looking for nearby. So we decided it would be interesting to set up a series of scans looking for these things. And normally with infrared photometry, you chop. In other words, you compare your source with an adjacent blank piece of sky. So that this takes out some of the background signals, cancels them out, especially at the longer wavelengths. But this couldn't be done in a very crowded field where your empty field often had something brighter in it than the thing you were actually trying to measure. So we decided to do DC scans. And this really illustrates the power of the observatory in those days, that Ian Glass could develop this photometer and have the parts made where we had essentially 3 detectors fed by 3 field lenses looking through 3 different filters, the J, H, and K, 1.2, 1.6, 2.2 micron, each with their preamplifiers here and with 3 apertures in front of this. So we could build this photometer, or Ian could build it, and we could assemble it especially for this task. And we mounted it on the back of the 1.9 meter. Here it is with the guiding facilities here. And you see this yellow pipe enabled us to pump on the liquid nitrogen to freeze it and lower the temperatures from about 73 to 62 or so. So our technique was simply to switch off the drive for 10 minutes and sample the signal every 0.04 seconds as the sky drifted past the detectors. And here you see a typical signal coming in here. This is the J band, and you can see a faint source here. This will be the H band, more noisy, and you will see that same source drifting past, and you'll see another source appearing, and this is the K band. So there they were. We did these 10-minute drifts. In other words, we recorded a 15,000 by 1 pixel image, and after we'd done every drift, we moved the telescope 8 arc seconds in declination. And I should add that we specially adapted or built the photometer to have a 12 by 6 arc second aperture, which of course is very large in terms of resolution on the sky, but it ensured with the 8 arc second overlap that every object that we observed went clear through the aperture at least once in one of our scans. And that meant that the great thing was that we could then do photometric work. It wasn't just going to be a pretty picture. We could actually make color magnitude diagrams, count sources, and do all kinds of things like that. And this shows the results of over from 1983 to 1985, 80 hours of observing. We managed 477 scans. And then the task was to put all this together, and it was also an interesting challenge, and one pioneered all kinds of techniques for field flattening and so on and so forth. And as I say, we were able to get quantitative results out of this, and we could measure the visual absorption in these regions on the edge of some of these clouds goes up.
Thank you very much.
35 magnitudes. Oh, does that mean I've talked too long?
No, it's fine, Robin.
Okay, I'm nearly finished, but I just want to say, so this to my mind was the strength of the sort of work we could do with this close cooperation between instrumentalists, astronomers, and engineers to put this kind of project together. But I have to illustrate that within 7 years, we had gone from 80 hours of observation to make this image here, and we had gone to 10 minutes of observation. This is also by Ian Glass, one of his photometers, using an image at 2.2 microns. And these are the annual reports for 1986 and 1993. I think I'll pop over the story of the darkroom and just finish off then. I just wanted to say a few things about domestic arrangements there. The management of the observatory, the domestic arrangements were overseen by Darney and his wife, which might have led to a certain clash of cultures. I well remember Darney storming into the dining room at dinner and accusing Peter Warren, who was an astronomer working on the 20-inch, of having a dirty mind. And we thought, oh my gosh, what is this? And his offense apparently was that he had used an excessive amount of lavatory paper to wrap up the filters he was using on the 20-inch photometer. Darney had that cultural, rather strong authoritarian streak, and which didn't go down very well with the more liberal view of astronomers. He didn't like the way we would adjust the thermostat on in the living area, and so he decided to cover it with a nice thick solid wooden box, which meant that the temperature of the place cycled over about 36 hours from freezing cold to boiling hot. There was the occasion when somebody, I think it might have been me, put a little moustache on the glass covering of the picture of Margaret Thatcher. I think it might have been me, because I remember thinking at the time that if I'd put it on the one of Forster, which was just next door to her, this would have been considered a matter of political sabotage that could have caused an enormous amount of trouble. Needless to say, it didn't go down very well. Darney finally left the site after he had a punch-up with a visiting astronomer, was transferred back to Pretoria, and where I think the administration in Pretoria discovered that this was not simply a cultural clash between English and Afrikaner. So on that jolly note of the times at Sutherland, I'll round off by just showing these series of images. This is how Sutherland was in 1973. And here we go to 1975. And if we go to 2002, well, that's what the observatory looks like today. And this has been a wonderful story of growth from relatively small beginnings. So I think at that point, Sivuile, I will stop talking. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robin, for such an informative, exciting presentation. Just check if people have written any questions, and because I'll allow this time for people to ask questions or for any comments.
Maybe somebody has some memories themselves.
Yeah, I see David has written something there.
I was just, as I was writing it, Robin actually mentioned the fact that this Darney guy punched an astronomer, and it was Keith Taylor, because I know Keith quite well. He told me the whole story about it.
Yes, I thought I shouldn't mention too many names in that respect. Yeah.
Are there any other questions or Robin? Prof? Are there any other questions or comments, colleagues? Okay, people are writing. Lovely talk, Historia. Thank you. Thank you for interesting informative talk.
So when are we having the next talk, Sivuile? Do we know, and who it is?
We have, it's going to be Greg Roberts, but we have not decided on the date, but it's going to be here in March. It's going to be in March. So we'll get back to meet probably this week. He has not finalized the date.
Excellent.
Wonderful talk. Thank you, Watsu. There's a question from David Fraser. Wonderful talk. Thank you. What is your view of on the future of Southerland in cooperation with other observatories?
Well, my view, I mean, of course, I come out to South Africa regularly, but I haven't been to Sutherland for some time. But it seems to me that the future of Sutherland is very well assured, with not only other people wanting to come and establish monitoring facilities at the longitude that Sutherland provides, and of course the latitude in the southern hemisphere, but hopefully when, well, Meerkat is already going, but that Sutherland will be very important in follow-up observations for SKA and so forth. So it seems to me, just looking at the site, you can't but think that telescopes are popping up like mushrooms all over the ridge. So I think, you know, it's an excellent story, just looking at those last images I showed.
And there's a question from, okay, yes. Was much photography ever done with the MRM at Sutherland?
Well, in the very early days, the answer is yes. Woolley was looking at Cepheids, and then I always remember Bill Martin and Woolley would come up to observe, and Woolley would have dinner, then he would start off, and at about 8 o'clock he would say, "Well, Martin, I think you can take over. I'm going to bed now." So Bill Martin did quite a lot of work. I think Cepheids, looking Magellanic Clouds, one of his projects. And then, of course, there was the Halley's Comet business, taking images with that. But yes, the story of photography, we built a special dark room with temperature-controlled water for the 74-inch when it came back, because photography had been the basis of work at Pretoria. It had been our main technique for most of the time. And I remember once going into the dark room and suddenly being confronted with this sauna, water pouring down the walls, the place full of steam, only to discover that they'd wired up the thermostat the wrong way round. So what happened was, it took quite a long time, maybe the following summer, before the temperature rose to 20 degrees centigrade, which was the temperature. And then at that point, the heater, instead of switching off, switched on for the first time and just boiled all the water away until somebody spotted it. So not much photography done at Sutherland.
Are there any other questions? I'm interested in the public highlights. You referred to the reappearance of Halley's Comet. Yes. I know that Tebe also referred, like he was kind of influenced by activities around the appearance of Halley's Comet. And also when we visited Graf Reinet, we heard that, you know, the people on the day of the appearance of Halley's Comet, 1986, they were celebrating 100 years of the town. So they came out to look at the, but they said it was a bit cloudy in their area. So just interested to what extent was, public engagement and outreach done in those days? Because it seems there's quite some information, looking at the story of Reverend and what Tebe referred to in one of his talks.
Well, there was quite a lot of public interest, and I'd have to consult my notes and so on, but I do remember public open days at the observatory fairly early on, and we had a kind of we had this Anarchy Yorsta, who also lived, I think her family were in Sutherland, and I seem to remember there were even, there were a little stalls and so on, and a little bit of a festival was held. But yeah, so there was, but that would be an open day. And I think we were also, there weren't a lot of visitors that came. So people who did want to visit would get shown around. So astronomy's always been fairly well ahead on public outreach. Sadly, for the public at large, I think there was a lot of interest in Halley, but it was very much a damp squib. I remember as Halley's comet proceeded across the sky, it went close to, I think it was 47 Tucani, which is a globular cluster. And then we got reports in that there were two comets, because a lot of people just focused on 47 Tuc, and the comet went on its way, and then they saw there was another comet. And all that says is that it was pretty damn faint.
Okay, there's another question from David Fraser. Any view on the interference of satellite like Starlink to observation?
That's all after my time. We went through a little bit of concern when Salpeterkop was always a lovely place to visit, and just to the south of the observatory, and it was thought that that might be mined, exploited. It's kimberlite. It doesn't contain diamonds, but it contains barium and so on. And there was a worry that if they mined there, lights would be a problem. But Starlink is all very, very much after my time. Yes, the Starlink satellites, yes.
And also, I'm interested in your picture. I've spoken to Professor Ian Glass, but I would love if you can maybe share some of those photographs, especially from the early days. It would be nice. Yeah, you can send them by email, Robin.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Well, ask me by email. I wasn't quite sure what you were asking there. What pictures of Ian Glass in his youth where you wanted? Yes.
Also, there are some of the images of the site in Sutherland, like those early days.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm not sure. No, it's just people are just grateful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the lovely talk. Natalie, the great talk. Thank you. Carol, thanks. I enjoyed your presentation very much. Yeah, I don't think are there any other questions, colleagues? There's, I think, David. Thank you, David.
No, I was just putting the applause.
Oh, the applause.
Oh. So thanks, David. That's great. Great to see you. I can see a few faces, albeit stills, but everybody seems a bit shy to show their real faces.
Nice to see you as well, Robin.
Yeah, yeah.
Time, right?
And there's Don next to you, looking just the same. Yep. And Ian, except they're all pictures. Yes. Yes. Good. Well, thank you.
Yes, Lisa.
Hi.
Thank you.
Hi, Lisa.
Hey, Robin. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Oh.
It was really a treat.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, good to see you again. Yeah. Okay. Okay, guys. Hi. Right.
Bye, Robin.
Okay, bye, Don. Bye, everybody. Yeah, yeah.
I'll talk to you soon.
Yep, yeah, indeed. Okay,
Oh, thank you, Robin. Thank you so much. I will invite you for the next talks. I'll inform you.
Good.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so
Good.
much.
Well, I will. Nice to see everybody. Thanks for coming. And I will also say goodbye. Yeah. Okay. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Nice. Thank you for joining in, colleagues and friends. Thank you so much.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Doc. Thank you so much.
Very cool. Ciao, ciao.
I'm going to end the meeting now for everyone. Thank you for joining in, colleagues. Thank you.